The old man's body hit the pavement behind the VA hospital like a question nobody wanted to answer. For 3 years, he had slept in that alley, invisible to the staff who walked past his cardboard shelter every morning on their way to save lives that mattered more than his. Now 2 orderlies stood over him in the gray morning light, coffee cups still steaming in their hands, debating whether to call an ambulance or simply drag him to the corner where he would become someone else's problem. One of them nudged his boot with a sneaker. "Still breathing," he said. "Barely." What none of them knew, what nobody walking through those hospital doors could have possibly imagined, was that in exactly 4 hours a Major General would be kneeling beside this man's bed with tears streaming down her face, holding his hand like he was the most precious thing she had ever touched. The taller orderly, a thick-necked man named Patterson who had stopped seeing patients as people sometime around his 3rd year on the job, took a long sip of his coffee and sighed. "We're going to have to bring him in, aren't we?" His partner, younger and still carrying some fragment of the idealism that had led him to healthcare in the first place, was already reaching for his radio. The old man on the ground hadn't moved except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest beneath a jacket held together with duct tape and prayers. His white stubble caught the early light. His hands, even unconscious, remained curled against his chest, as though protecting something precious hidden beneath the grime. They loaded him onto a gurney with the efficiency of men who had done this 100 times before. Patterson made sure to position the old man's arms so they wouldn't hang over the sides and slow them down in the corridors. "Probably drunk," he muttered. "Or crazy. Or both. You know how these guys are." The younger orderly said nothing, but he noticed the way the old man's fingers stayed wrapped around something metallic that glinted beneath the fluorescent lights as they wheeled him through the automatic doors. The emergency intake area of the VA Medical Center had the cheerful ambience of a bus station at 3 in the morning. Beige walls the color of institutional despair. Fluorescent lights that buzzed and flickered with a rhythm that could drive a sane person to madness. The smell of antiseptic fighting a losing battle against decades of human suffering. Curtained bays lined both walls, and in each one lay a veteran whose country had made promises it never intended to keep. The nurses' station sat in the center like a fortress, and from behind its walls came the constant percussion of keyboards and the occasional sharp laugh that had nothing to do with joy. They wheeled the old man into Bay 7, a corner spot near a window that looked out over the very alley where he had been sleeping. If he woke and turned his head, he would see his cardboard shelter still standing, arranged with a precision that seemed almost military. The gurney locked into place with a metallic click, and Patterson was already backing away, already washing his hands of responsibility. "Intake nurse will be by," he said to no one in particular. "Make sure he doesn't pull out any lines." The intake nurse who eventually appeared was a woman in her 50s named Dolores who had long ago replaced compassion with efficiency. She approached Bay 7 with a clipboard and an expression that suggested the old man's existence was a personal inconvenience. "Name?" she demanded, not looking up from her forms. When no answer came, she clicked her pen with irritation and finally glanced at the figure in the bed. His eyes were closed. His lips were cracked and pale. His clothes smelled of the street, and something worse beneath. Dolores wrinkled her nose and made a note on her clipboard. "John Doe," she wrote. "Homeless. Found unresponsive behind facility. Probably intoxication." She checked his vitals with mechanical precision, her hands moving through the motions while her mind was already on her lunch break. Blood pressure low. Heart rate irregular. Temperature slightly elevated. She noted each number without registering what they meant, without seeing the scars on his hands that told a story she would never think to ask about. When she lifted his wrist to check his pulse, his fingers tightened reflexively around the objects pressed against his chest. For just a moment, Dolores paused. She could see metal between his fingers, something on a chain. But the phone at the nurse's station was ringing, and her moment of curiosity evaporated like rain on hot concrete. The morning wore on. Doctors made rounds with the enthusiasm of prisoners walking the yard. Medical students trailed behind them like ducklings, scribbling notes they would never read again. And in Bay 7, The old man lay still as stone, his eyes moving beneath closed lids as though watching battles no one else could see. His fingers never stopped their slow movement across whatever he held against his heart. Sometimes his lips moved too, forming words in a whisper too soft to hear. Names, perhaps. Prayers. Confessions meant for ghosts. It was nearly 10 in the morning when Dr. Howard Vance made his appearance. The chief of medicine moved through the ward like a man who had confused authority with divinity, his white coat starched stiff as judgment. He stopped at each bay just long enough to make the patient feel inadequate, his comments pitched loud enough for the surrounding staff to hear and fear. When he reached Bay 7, he didn't even slow down at first. His eyes swept over the unconscious old man, took in the grime and the worn clothes and the years of hard living written across weathered features, and he made his assessment in the space of a heartbeat. Another frequent flyer, Vance announced to no one and everyone. He turned to the trailing residents with the smile of a man about to deliver wisdom. This is what I mean about resource allocation. These beds are for veterans who need medical care, not for every homeless person who wants a warm place to sleep. His voice carried across the ward, reaching the ears of patients and staff alike. Someone find out who admitted him. I want to know why we're wasting resources on cases like this. A young resident hesitated. Sir, he was found unconscious. There could be underlying conditions. Vance's smile didn't waver, but his eyes went cold. Underlying conditions. Yes, I'm sure there are. Alcoholism, drug abuse, mental illness. Pick your favorite. The point, doctor, is that men like this have chosen their path. They don't get to consume resources meant for veterans who actually served with honor. The words hung in the antiseptic air like a verdict. Patients in nearby bays looked away. Nurses found urgent tasks at their computers. And in Bay 7, unseen by anyone, the old man's eyes had opened. Just a sliver. Just enough to see the doctor in the white coat walking away. Just enough to hear every word. His fingers continued their slow movement across the dog tags pressed against his chest. And wrapped around those tags, catching the light through the window, was a woman's rosary, its beads worn smooth by decades of prayer. The shift change came at 11, and with it came Lieutenant Maya Okonkwo. She walked onto the ward with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen worse things than a busy VA hospital, which she had. 2 tours with Marine units in Syria had taught her what real suffering looked like, and it had also taught her that the men and women who carried that suffering deserved more than clipboard efficiency and averted eyes. She checked in at the nurse's station, received her patient assignments, and noted that Bay 7 had been marked with the informal code the staff used for patients they considered wastes of time. She ignored the code and headed toward the corner bed by the window. The old man was awake now, though awake seemed too strong a word for the state he was in. His eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling with the 1,000-yard stare she recognized from her own mirror in the months after she came home. His hand still rested on his chest, still wrapped around whatever he was protecting there. When Maya pulled back the curtain and stepped into his space, those eyes shifted to her face with an awareness that surprised her. Most patients in his condition took hours to track movement. This man assessed her in a single glance, cataloging her position, her bearing, her potential threat level, before his gaze softened into something almost like relief. Good morning, Maya said, her voice warm but professional. I am Lieutenant Okonkwo. I'll be your nurse for the rest of the day. How are you feeling? The old man's lips moved, cracked and dry, and what came out was barely a whisper. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Maya felt something shift in her chest. That automatic formality, that ingrained respect. She had heard it 1,000 times from veterans who had spent so many years in uniform that the habits had become permanent features of their personalities. She pulled up a chair and sat down, putting herself at his eye level rather than standing over him like an authority figure. Let's get you some water first, she said. Then we need to finish your intake forms. The previous nurse left some blanks. She helped him drink from a cup with a straw, holding it steady when his hands trembled too much to grip it himself. He drank slowly, carefully, like a man who had learned not to take small mercies for granted. When he finished, he whispered, "Thank you again," and Maya felt that shift in her chest deepen into something that felt almost like recognition. She had seen broken men before. She had been one herself, in her own way. But there was something about this one that didn't fit the profile the staff had assigned him. She picked up her tablet and began working through the intake questions. "Name?" "Navarro," he said. His voice was stronger now, though still rough as sandpaper. "Elias Navarro." "Date of birth?" "November 3rd, 1953. Maya did the math. 71 years old. She had guessed older from his appearance, but hard living aged a person faster than time alone ever could. "Branch of service?" "Army, ma'am." She entered each answer, watching him from the corner of her eye. His responses came without hesitation, delivered with the precision of a man who had answered these questions 1,000 times on 1,000 forms throughout his military career. Most homeless patients she encountered struggled with dates, with details, with the basic facts of their own histories. This man spoke like he was delivering a briefing. "Years of service?" 32 years, ma'am. 1971 to 2003. Maya's fingers paused over the tablet. 32 years was a full career, and then some. The kind of career that usually ended with a pension and benefits and a comfortable retirement, not with sleeping behind a VA hospital in a cardboard shelter. She looked at him more carefully now, seeing past the grime and the gauntness to the structure beneath. The way he held himself, even lying in a hospital bed. The economy of his movements when he reached for the water cup. The scars on his hands that spoke of violence survived. "Rank at discharge?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral. For the first time, the old man hesitated. His fingers moved across the objects on his chest, and Maya caught a glimpse of metal chain and worn beads. When he spoke, his voice had dropped even lower, as though the words themselves carried weight he was reluctant to release. "Command Sergeant Major, ma'am." Maya's stylus stopped moving entirely. "Command Sergeant Major." The highest enlisted rank in the United States Army. The kind of rank that took decades of exceptional service to achieve. The kind of rank that meant this man had once been responsible for the lives and welfare of hundreds of soldiers. She looked at him again, and this time she saw the ghost of who he must have been beneath the ravages of whatever had brought him to this place. "Unit?" she asked, and her voice had changed too, grown softer and more careful, as though she were handling something fragile. The old man's eyes closed. His fingers continued their slow movement across the dog tags and rosary, and Maya could see now that there were two sets of tags tangled together, his own and another's. When he opened his eyes again, there was something in them that made her breath catch, a depth of pain that went beyond physical suffering, a weight that had nothing to do with illness. "First Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta," he said. His voice was quiet, but each word landed with the precision of a rifle shot. Maya felt the blood drain from her face. She knew that designation. Every combat medic knew that designation. Delta Force, the most elite special operations unit in the United States military. The unit whose operations were so classified that most of them would never appear in any official record. The unit whose members were whispered about in training facilities and special operations briefings like figures from mythology rather than flesh and blood. She stared at the old man in the hospital bed, at his weathered face and trembling hands and the cardboard shelter visible through the window behind him. And she thought about the operations she had studied during her own training, the classified briefings where certain names appeared again and again. Names that were spoken with reverence. Call signs that have become legends. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we'd love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below telling us your city or country. And if stories like this one about courage, sacrifice, and second chances speak to you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that honor the forgotten heroes among us. Now let's continue. Her hand was trembling now, she realized. The tablet felt suddenly heavy in her grip. She needed to ask the next question, but she already knew what the answer would be, and she wasn't sure she was ready to hear it. "Call sign," she whispered. The old man looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were clear now, clearer than they had any right to be after what his body had endured. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 32 years of service, of missions that would remain classified until everyone who knew about them was dead, of brothers lost and promises broken, and a life that had somehow led from the most elite unit in the American military to a cardboard shelter behind a VA hospital. "Spectre," he said. "They call me Spectre." Maya sat frozen in her chair. The tablet had gone dark in her hands, the intake form forgotten. She knew that name. She had studied operations at that level in her combat medic training, and one call sign had appeared more than any other in the classified briefings. A ghost story, a legend. The operator who had been everywhere and nowhere, who had pulled off extractions that should have been impossible, who had saved lives that the official records would never acknowledge. She looked at the man in the bed, at the dog tags clutched against his chest, at the rosary wrapped around them like a prayer made tangible. And she knew, with a certainty that went beyond evidence or logic, that she was sitting next to a piece of living history that everyone had forgotten existed. She needed to make a phone call. Maya found the senior nurse at the central station, a heavy-set woman named Gertrude who had been running this ward since before Maya was born. She approached with the tablet clutched against her chest, trying to keep her voice steady, trying to sound professional rather than shaken. "I need to speak with Dr. Vance," she said, "about the patient in Base 7. Gertrude looked up from her computer with the weary expression of someone who had heard every possible request and found them all equally tedious. "Dr. Vance is on rounds," she said, "and he's already made his assessment of that patient. Discharge as soon as stable. We need the bed." Maya shook her head. "There's been a mistake. His intake information indicates significant military service. Delta Force. Command Sergeant Major. 32 years. This isn't just another homeless veteran. This could be someone important." The words hung in the air between them, and Maya watched Gertrude's expression shift from boredom to skepticism to something that looked almost like pity. "Honey," Gertrude said, leaning back in her chair, "do you know how many patients we get through here claiming to be Special Forces? Navy SEALs? Delta operators? Last month, we had a man insist he was personally responsible for killing bin Laden. The month before that, someone claimed to be a CIA assassin with 50 confirmed kills." She shook her head slowly. "These men are sick. Mentally, physically, spiritually. They create fantasies to cope with lives that didn't turn out the way they hoped. It's sad, but it's not our job to validate their delusions." "This is different," Maya insisted. "The way he carries himself, the precision of his answers, the scars on his hands. I worked with special operators before. I know what they look like, and this man has all the markers." Gertrude's pity deepened into something closer to condescension. "Lieutenant Okonkwo, you've been here 3 months. I've been here 22 years. Trust me when I tell you that the patient in Base 7 is exactly what he appears to be. A homeless veteran with mental health issues who has learned to tell convincing stories. Now finish his intake, note his claims in the file, and let Dr. Vance make the medical decisions. That's how this works." Maya opened her mouth to argue further, but before she could speak, a voice cut across the nurse's station like a blade. "Did I hear my name?" Dr. Howard Vance had materialized behind her with the silent approach of a predator who enjoyed watching prey squirm. His white coat was immaculate. His smile was professionally warm and personally cold. His eyes moved from Maya to Gertrude and back again with the calculating assessment of a man who missed nothing and forgave less. "Lieutenant Okonkwo has concerns about the patient in Base 7, Gertrude said, her tone carefully neutral. She believes his claims of distinguished service may be legitimate. Vance's smile widened, but his eyes stayed frozen. "Ah, yes, the frequent flyer. Let me guess, he told you he was Special Forces? Delta? Maybe a Medal of Honor recipient?" His voice carried across the station, loud enough for nearby staff to hear, loud enough for patients in the closest bays to catch every word. "I've seen this 100 times, Lieutenant. These men have nothing left except their fantasies. They convinced themselves they were heroes because the alternative, accepting that they wasted their lives, is too painful to bear. Sir, Maya said, fighting to keep her voice level. His responses were too precise to be fabricated. He knew his unit designation, his rank structure, details that a civilian wouldn't know to invent. If we could just verify his service record before discharge, it would only take a few hours. Vance's smile disappeared. A few hours. Do you know what a few hours cost this facility, Lieutenant? Do you know how many veterans with actual medical needs are waiting for beds while we babysit delusional, homeless men who want a warm place to sleep? He stepped closer to her, using his height to emphasize the power differential. I've already made my assessment. Discharge as soon as he's stable. If you have a problem with that, you can file a complaint with administration. But I promise you, they will side with the chief of medicine over a junior nurse who's been here less than a season. The ward had gone quiet around them. Staff at nearby computers had stopped typing. Patients in the closest bays were watching through gaps in their curtains. Maya could feel the weight of all those eyes, could feel the institutional pressure bearing down on her to submit, to comply, to accept the hierarchy and move on. But she had faced worse pressure in places far more dangerous than this, and she had learned that sometimes the right thing to do was the hardest thing to do. Sir, she said quietly, with all due respect, I believe we have a duty to verify this patient's claims before we discharge him back to the street. Vance's face went red. The professional warmth vanished entirely, replaced by cold fury. You believe? A nurse who has been here 3 months believes she knows better than the chief of medicine. He turned to address the watching staff, his voice rising to a theatrical volume. This is exactly the kind of insubordination that wastes resources and undermines efficiency. This patient has been evaluated. His disposition has been determined. And if Lieutenant Okonkwo cannot follow simple protocols, perhaps she needs to reconsider whether this facility is the right fit for her career. Maya felt the threat land like a physical blow. Her career, her livelihood, everything she had worked for since leaving the Navy. Vance was making it clear that pursuing this further would cost her everything. Behind her, she heard the soft sound of footsteps. She turned to see a man in a rumpled administrator's blazer approaching the station with a tablet in his hand and a carefully neutral expression on his face. His name tag read Marcus Webb, and something about the way he held his tablet, angled slightly toward the confrontation, made Maya wonder if he was recording. Dr. Vance, Webb said smoothly, I have some budget reports that need your signature when you have a moment. Vance glared at the interruption, then smoothed his expression back to professional calm. Of course. He turned back to Maya with a final cold smile. Discharge the patient by end of shift, Lieutenant. That's not a request. Then he strode away toward his office, white coat billowing behind him like the robes of a hanging judge. Maya stood frozen at the nurse's station, watching him go. Around her, the ward slowly returned to its normal rhythms. Keyboards resumed their clicking. Phones began ringing again. But in Bay 7, visible through the gap in the curtains, she could see the old man lying still in his bed, his eyes open, his fingers moving slowly across the dog tags and rosary pressed against his heart. He had heard everything. She was certain of it. He had heard himself dismissed as a liar, a delusional homeless man, a waste of resources. And he had said nothing, done nothing, simply lay there and absorbed the humiliation with the quiet dignity of a man who had endured far worse. Maya made her decision. She turned away from the nurse's station and walked toward the supply closet at the far end of the ward. Inside, surrounded by boxes of gauze and shelves of medical supplies, she pulled out her personal phone and began searching for a number she had never thought she would need to call. The regional military installation. The commanding general's office. Someone who could verify whether the man in Bay 7 was who he claimed to be, or whether she was about to destroy her career for a fantasy. Her hand was shaking as she dialed, but she dialed anyway. The light through the window had shifted to afternoon gold, and Elias lay watching dust motes drift through the sunbeams like tiny souls searching for a place to rest. His fingers moved across the rosary beads without conscious thought, a rhythm as natural to him now as breathing. 53 beads, 10 for each decade. 5 for the mysteries. He had counted them 10,000 times since Maria pressed them into his hands on the day she died. He could still see her face in that hospital room, so different from this one, yet somehow exactly the same. The same fluorescent lights, the same beeping monitors, the same smell of antiseptic trying to mask the smell of endings. She had been so thin by then, her beautiful face reduced to angles and shadows, but her eyes had stayed bright until the very last moment. Those dark eyes that had seen him through 30 years of marriage, through deployments and homecomings, through the birth of children they never had and the death of friends they mourned together. "Take these," she had whispered, pressing the rosary into his palm. "My mother gave them to me when I was 16. I've prayed on them every day since. Now you pray on them for me." He had tried to speak, tried to tell her that he wasn't a praying man, that he didn't know the words, that he didn't deserve to hold something so precious when he had failed her so completely. But she had pressed a finger to his lips and smiled that smile that had sustained him through every dark night in every godforsaken corner of the world. "You didn't fail me, Elias. You gave me everything. Now I need you to promise me something." Anything, he had managed to say. Anything. "Live," she had said. "That's all. Just live." 3 days later she was gone, and Elias had discovered that living was the one mission he didn't know how to complete. The memory dissolved as footsteps approached his bed. He turned his head, expecting to see the nurse who had taken his information that morning, the young one with the kind eyes who had looked at him like he was a person rather than a problem. Instead, he saw a woman he didn't recognize, middle-aged with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and glasses that magnified eyes full of patient intelligence. She wore a white coat like the others, but something about her bearing was different, softer, less weaponized. "Mr. Navarro," she said, pulling up the chair the young nurse had used earlier. "I am Dr. Priya Sharma. I work in the psychiatric department here, specializing in trauma. Lieutenant Okonkwo mentioned you might benefit from someone to talk to." Elias said nothing. His fingers continued their slow journey across the rosary beads. Dr. Sharma didn't seem bothered by silence. She settled into the chair with the comfortable patience of someone who had sat with silent men before and understood that words would come when they were ready, or they wouldn't come at all. Either way was acceptable. Either way she would stay. Minutes passed. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. Somewhere down the ward, a phone rang and was answered. Elias watched the dust motes drift and thought about all the ways he had failed the people he loved. "Her name was Maria," he said finally. His voice came out like rust scraping against rust, rough and broken from years of disuse. "And I let her die alone while I was burying my best friend." Dr. Sharma didn't react with surprise or pity or any of the responses Elias had learned to expect from people who heard fragments of his story. She simply nodded, her eyes steady on his face. "Tell me about her," she said, and somehow, for reasons he couldn't explain, Elias did. He told her about meeting Maria at a church social in San Antonio in 1973, 2 months before he shipped out for his first deployment. About the way she laughed with her whole body, throwing her head back and letting joy consume her completely. About the letters she wrote him every single day during every single deployment, letters he still had in a storage unit somewhere, tied with ribbon and smelling faintly of the perfume she always wore. He told her about the wedding, small and simple, just family and a few friends from his unit. About the apartment they shared in Fayetteville, and then the house in Tampa, and then the dozens of temporary homes they made in places around the world wherever the Army sent them. About the children they tried to have and couldn't, and the way Maria transformed her grief into love for every child she taught in 28 years of elementary school. He told her about Thomas Odia, call sign Ghost, his best friend and partner for 15 years of operations that would never appear in any official record. About the ambush in Afghanistan in 2011 that had finally caught up with them after decades of cheating death. About holding Ghost in his arms while his blood soaked into the Afghan dirt, listening to his last words whispered through a mouth full of copper. "Go home to her, Eli. Live the life I can't." He told her about coming home from Ghost Memorial 2 weeks later to find a letter from Maria's doctor sitting on the kitchen counter. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Diagnosis dated 3 weeks earlier. She hadn't told him because she didn't want him to leave his brother's funeral. She hadn't told him because she knew he would blame himself for not being there. She had carried that weight alone, so he wouldn't have to. 8 months, Elias said. His fingers had stopped moving on the rosary. His eyes were fixed on something far beyond the hospital ceiling. I had 8 months with her. Every day, I told her I was sorry. Every day, she told me to stop apologizing and start living. And every day, I failed her a little more. How did you fail her? Dr. Sharma asked quietly. Elias was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. I saved senators, he said. Diplomats. Generals. Hostages whose names I never knew and faces I've forgotten. I went into places that don't exist on any map and brought people home who would have died without me. But my wife. He swallowed hard against the tightness in his throat. My wife I couldn't save. And after she died, I couldn't save myself either. He turned his head to look at Dr. Sharma for the first time since she had sat down. His eyes were dry, but something behind them had cracked open. She wanted me to live, he said. That was her last request. And instead I've spent 3 years dying as slowly as I could manage. Dr. Sharma reached out and placed her hand over the rosary and the dog tags and the accumulated grief of a lifetime. I'm not here to fix you, she said softly. I'm not here to tell you how to feel or what to do. I'm just here so you're not alone. That's all. Just so you're not alone. Elias stared at her hand on his. It was the first touch with kindness he had felt in 3 years. And somewhere deep in his chest, in the place where Maria's memory lived alongside Ghost's last words, something shifted. Not healing, not yet, but the first trembling suggestion that healing might someday be possible. Outside the window, the afternoon light continued its slow journey toward evening. And in the supply closet at the end of the ward, Maya Okonkwo was listening to a phone ring on the other end of a line that connected to the regional military installation, waiting for someone to answer, praying that she wasn't making the biggest mistake of her career. The phone rang 4 times before anyone answered. Maya stood in the supply closet, surrounded by boxes of surgical gloves and stacks of bedpans, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her teeth. When a voice finally came through the line, it was clipped and professional and utterly unhelpful. Regional Military Installation, Commander's Office. How may I direct your call? Maya took a breath and tried to sound like someone who made calls like this every day. This is Lieutenant Maya Okonkwo, registered nurse at the VA Medical Center. I need to verify the service record of a patient who claims to have served with 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. There was a pause on the other end. A long pause. When the voice returned, it had lost some of its professional polish. Ma'am, I'm not sure what you're asking, but any inquiries regarding Special Operations personnel need to go through official channels. I can transfer you to the Public Affairs Office if you'd like to submit a formal request. Maya closed her eyes. Official channels. Formal requests. The kind of bureaucratic maze that took weeks to navigate while Dr. Vance discharged Elias back to the street by end of shift. She didn't have weeks. She had hours. Please, she said, abandoning protocol. The patient's name is Elias Navarro. Call sign Spectre. He claims to have served 32 years, retiring as Command Sergeant Major. I know this sounds unusual, but I have reason to believe his claims may be legitimate, and he's about to be discharged against his will. If there's anyone there who can verify his service quickly, it could make the difference between this man getting the help he needs and being thrown back onto the street. Another pause. Longer this time. Maya could hear typing in the background, then the click of the call being transferred. She waited, listening to hold music that seemed designed to test the limits of human patience. 1 minute. 2. 3. She was about to hang up and try a different approach when a new voice came on the line. This voice was different. Older. Female. With an undertone of steel that suggested whoever owned it had spent decades giving orders and having them obeyed. This is Major General Catherine Reeves. Say that name again. Maya's breath caught. A major general had taken her call. A 2-star general had picked up the phone for a random nurse at a VA hospital. Whatever she had stumbled into, it was bigger than she had imagined. Navarro, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Elias Navarro. Call sign Spectre. He says he served with Delta from 1971 to 2003. The silence that followed was so complete that Maya thought the call had dropped. Then she heard something that sounded almost like a sharp intake of breath. Almost like shock. "Where is he?" a general said. Her voice had changed. The steel was still there, but now it was wrapped around something else. Something that sounded almost like desperation. "Which hospital? Give me the exact location." Now, Maya gave the address, the ward number, the bay number. She explained about Dr. Vance's discharge order, about the end of shift deadline, about the way the staff had dismissed Elias as just another delusional homeless veteran. With each detail, she could hear the general's breathing grow more controlled, more focused, the way Maya herself had learned to breathe before entering a combat zone. "Listen to me carefully," General Reeves said when Maya had finished. "Do not let anyone discharge that man. Do you understand me? I don't care what the chief of medicine says. I don't care what protocols you have to break. You keep him in that bed until I get there." "Ma'am," Maya said, feeling the weight of what she was being asked to do, "I don't have the authority to countermand a doctor's orders. If Dr. Vance insists on discharge, there's nothing I can legally do to stop him." "Then find something illegal," the general said. "Lose his paperwork. Claim a medical emergency. Tell them the president himself is on his way if you have to. I will deal with the consequences personally. But that man does not leave that hospital before I arrive." Maya swallowed hard. "May I ask, ma'am, how you know this patient?" There was another pause. When the general spoke again, her voice had softened into something that sounded almost vulnerable. "Mogadishu," she said. "October 1993. I was a captain then, leading a supply convoy that got ambushed in the worst part of the city. My vehicle took an RPG. 3 of my soldiers were killed instantly. I was hit in the leg and the shoulder, bleeding out in an alley while hostiles closed in from every direction." She paused, and Maya could hear the weight of memory in her breathing. A man appeared out of nowhere. No backup, no extraction plan. Just him and his rifle and a determination that defied every tactical reality of that situation. He killed 11 hostiles in 3 minutes. Then he picked me up and carried me 2 miles through enemy territory to the extraction point. He had 3 bullets in his own leg. He never mentioned them until we were on the helicopter. Maya felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. She looked through the supply closet's small window toward Base 7, toward the curtain that hid the man who had done these things, who had saved this woman's life, and then disappeared into a cardboard shelter behind a VA hospital. "I owe that man everything," General Reeves said. "Every promotion I've earned, every soldier I've led, every day I've been alive for the last 31 years. It's all because of him." She paused again, and when she continued, her voice had hardened back into command. "I'm leaving now. I should be there in 90 minutes. Maybe less if I break some traffic laws. You keep him there, Lieutenant. Whatever it takes." "Yes, ma'am," Maya said. "I understand." The line went dead. Maya stood in the supply closet for a long moment, phone pressed against her chest, trying to process what she had just learned. The homeless man in Base 7, the delusional frequent flyer, the waste of resources. He had saved a major general's life. He had carried her through enemy fire with bullets in his own leg. He was a hero whose name was apparently known at the highest levels of military command. And in less than 2 hours, Dr. Vance was going to throw him out like garbage. Maya squared her shoulders and opened the supply closet door. She had 90 minutes to stall. 90 minutes to prevent a discharge that the chief of medicine had ordered in front of the entire ward. 90 minutes to put her career and possibly her freedom on the line for a man she had met only hours ago. She had faced worse odds in Syria, but not by much. As she walked back toward the nurse's station, she saw Dr. Vance emerging from his office with a clipboard in his hand and a satisfied smile on his face. He was heading toward Base 7. And she had absolutely no idea how she was going to stop him. Maya intercepted Dr. Vance 3 steps from Base 7. She moved into his path with the kind of deliberate positioning she had learned in combat situations, placing herself between the threat and the person she was protecting. The chief of medicine stopped short, his satisfied smile curdling into irritation. "Lieutenant Okonkwo," he said, his voice carrying the warning tone of a man who is not accustomed to being blocked. "I believe I gave you clear instructions." "Yes, sir," Maya said, "but I need to inform you of a change in the patient's condition. His vitals have become unstable. I've ordered additional monitoring and diagnostic tests. Discharge isn't advisable at this time." Vance's eyes narrowed. He looked past her toward Bay 7, where Elias lay visible through the gap in the curtains. The old man appeared unchanged, his fingers still moving across the rosary, his gaze still fixed on some point beyond the ceiling. Nothing about his appearance suggested medical instability. Nothing except the desperate lie Maya was trying to sell. "What specifically has changed?" Vance demanded. Maya's mind raced through every condition she could plausibly fabricate. Cardiac arrhythmia showing on the monitor. Possible signs of early sepsis. Blood pressure fluctuations that need observation. "I've requested a consult from cardiology." "Without my authorization?" "Sir, you were in your office." The patient's condition required immediate action. "I followed emergency protocols." Vance's face had gone the particular shade of red that Maya was learning to associate with professional danger. He stepped closer to her, close enough that she could smell his coffee breath. "Let me be very clear, Lieutenant. I reviewed this patient's charts myself not 2 hours ago. His vitals were stable. His condition was unremarkable. The only thing wrong with him is that he's homeless and delusional and taking up a bed that could be used for someone who actually deserves our care." Around them, the ward had gone quiet again. Staff at the nurses' station had stopped their work. Patients in nearby bays were watching through curtain gaps. Marcus Webb had appeared from somewhere, his tablet held at that particular angle that suggested recording. Maya felt the weight of all those eyes and knew that whatever happened next would determine the trajectory of her entire career. "Sir," she said, keeping her voice steady, "I understand your concerns about resource allocation. But my professional judgment as the nurse assigned to this patient is that discharge at this time poses unacceptable medical risk. I've documented my observations in his chart. If you choose to override my assessment, that will also be documented." The threat hung in the air between them. Documentation. The magic word that made administrators and lawyers pay attention. Vance understood exactly what she was saying. If he discharged Elias and something happened, there would be a paper trail leading directly to his door. His smile returned, but it was the smile of a predator circling prey, looking for a new angle of attack. "Fine," he said. "We'll wait for your cardiology consult, but I want to examine the patient myself. Right now. And if I find that your concerns are unfounded, Lieutenant, we will be having a very serious conversation about your future at this facility." He pushed past her toward Base 7, and Maya had no choice but to follow. Elias watched them approach with those assessing eyes that seemed to take in everything and reveal nothing. Dr. Sharma had left sometime during Maya's phone call, but the chair she had occupied still sat beside the bed, evidence of a connection that had briefly formed. Vance ignored it, positioning himself at the foot of the bed with his clipboard like a shield. "Mr. Navarro," he said, pronouncing the name with exaggerated care. "I'm Dr. Vance, Chief of Medicine. I understand you've been telling my staff quite a story about your military service." Elias said nothing. His fingers continued their slow journey across the rosary beads. Vance's smile sharpened. "Delta Force, was it? Command Sergeant Major? 32 years of classified operations?" He shook his head with theatrical disappointment. "Do you know how many men I've seen come through this ward with similar claims? Dozens. Hundreds. And do you know what they all have in common?" Still Elias said nothing. But something in his eyes had changed. A stillness that went beyond patience. A focus that seemed to sharpen the air around him. "They're all liars," Vance continued. "Delusional men who can't accept what their lives have become. So they invent glorious pasts to compensate. You're not a hero, Mr. Navarro. You're not a legend. You're a homeless man with mental health issues who has learned to tell convincing stories. And in about 1 hour, you're going to be back on the street where you belong. Maya watched Elias's face for any reaction. For anger, for hurt, for the kind of defensive response that might give Vance more ammunition. But the old man simply looked at the doctor with an expression that was almost pitying, as though he had heard variations of these words 1,000 times, and they had long ago lost their power to wound. Vance seemed frustrated by the lack of response. He moved around the side of the bed, reaching for Elias's wrist. "Let me see these famous dog tags," he said. "The ones you've been clutching like they're made of gold. I'm betting we'll find they're fakes. Bought at a surplus store. Engraved with a name you found in a book somewhere." His hand closed around Elias's wrist and pulled. The old man's fingers resisted for a moment, then released. The dog tags and rosary came free, dangling from Vance's grip. But as the doctor lifted them toward the light, the sleeve of Elias's hospital gown rode up his forearm. And there it was. Maya saw it first. A tattoo covering most of the inner forearm, faded by age and obscured by grime, but unmistakable in its imagery. A skull with crossed daggers beneath it. The insignia of Delta Force. And below that, in precise military numerals, a set of coordinates. A date. And what looked like initials, multiple sets of them, arranged in a pattern that could only be a memorial. Vance saw it too. His hand froze in midair, the dog tags forgotten, his eyes fixed on the tattoo with an expression that was slowly transitioning from contempt to confusion. "What is this?" he said, his voice less certain than before. "Some kind of elaborate fake?" Elias finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that seemed to fill the entire bay. "Those are coordinates," he said. 2.0469 degrees north, 45.3182 degrees east. Mogadishu, Somalia. October 3rd, 1993. And those initials belong to brothers I carried home in body bags while you were probably still in medical school. His eyes met Vance's, and for the first time, Maya saw the soldier beneath the homeless man. The operator, the legend, the man who had killed 11 hostiles in 3 minutes, and then carried a wounded captain 2 miles through enemy territory with bullets in his leg. "You can throw me out if you want," Elias said. "You can call me a liar and a delusional and a waste of your precious resources. But don't you ever call my brothers fakes. Don't you ever." The silence that followed was so complete that Maya could hear her own heartbeat. Vance stood frozen with the dog tags still in his hand, his face pale, his mouth slightly open. Around them, the ward had become a gallery of witnesses, every eye fixed on the confrontation in Bay 7. Then, from the far end of the ward, came the sound of doors bursting open. The first thing Maya saw was uniforms. Military police in crisp dress, uniforms flooding through the ward entrance like a tide of authority. Behind them came aides with tablets and communications officers with earpieces and the kind of organized chaos that only accompanied very important people. Staff scrambled out of the way. Patients craned their necks to see. Even Dr. Vance turned from Bay 7, the dog tag still dangling forgotten from his hand, his face frozen in an expression of complete incomprehension. Then she walked in. Major General Catherine Reeves moved through the ward like a force of nature contained in human form. Her dress uniform was immaculate, rows of ribbons and medals catching the fluorescent light. 2 silver stars gleamed on each shoulder. Her gray hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her face carried the particular kind of beauty that came from decades of command, of decisions made under pressure, of lives saved and lost and carried forward. She was not a tall woman, but she seemed to fill the entire space with her presence. Every military-trained person in the ward snapped to attention automatically. Maya felt her own spine straighten, her heels click together, her hand rise toward her forehead before she even consciously registered what she was doing. Around her, she saw other veterans among the patients doing the same from their beds, from their wheelchairs, from wherever they could manage to straighten themselves into something resembling attention. General Reeves walked straight past the nurse's station, past the frozen staff, past Marcus Webb with his recording tablet, past Dr. Vance, who stood with his mouth open and the dog tags still clutched in his hand like evidence of a crime he no longer understood. She walked directly to Bay 7 and stopped at the foot of the bed. Elias was trying to sit up. His arms trembled with the effort, his body weakened by years of neglect and the illness that had brought him here. But something in his eyes had changed. The 1,000-yard stare was gone. In its place was recognition, and something that looked almost like fear. "Ma'am," he said, his voice hoarse, "you shouldn't be here." General Reeves's composure cracked. Just for a moment. Just enough for Maya to see the emotion beneath the command presence. Then she stepped around the side of the bed and placed her hand on Elias's shoulder, gently pressing him back against the pillows. "At ease, Sergeant Major," she said. Her voice broke slightly on the rank. "At ease." She pulled up the chair that Dr. Sharma had used earlier and sat down beside his bed. Her hand found his, the one still wrapped around the rosary, and she held it the way you hold something precious and fragile and long believed lost. "Spectre," she said. "My God, we looked for you for years." The ward had gone absolutely silent. Not the uncomfortable silence of witnesses to a confrontation, but the reverent silence of people who understood they were watching something sacred. Maya saw tears on the faces of patients in nearby bays. She saw staff members frozen in place, afraid to move, afraid to break the spell. "I didn't want to be found," Elias said quietly. "I didn't deserve to be found." General Reeves shook her head. "That's not for you to decide, Sergeant Major." She squeezed his hand tighter. "Do you know how many people owe you their lives? Do you have any idea how many soldiers came home because of you? How many families stayed whole? How many children grew up with fathers because Elias Navarro was there when it mattered?" Elias looked away, toward the window, toward the alley where his cardboard shelter still stood in its precise military arrangement. "Not enough," he said. "Never enough." Behind them, Maya heard Dr. Vance finally find his voice. "Excuse me," he said, and there was a tremor in it now, a crack in the armor of professional authority. "General, I don't know what's happening here, but this patient is scheduled for discharge. Hospital policy requires that I maintain control of my ward regardless of who walks through those doors." General Reeves didn't turn around. She didn't acknowledge Vance at all. Instead, she continued looking at Elias, her thumb moving gently across his weathered knuckles. "Do you remember Mogadishu?" she asked softly. "October 1993? Elias's eyes closed. "Yes, ma'am. I was a captain then. Supply convoy. Wrong place at the wrong time." She paused, and Maya could see the memory playing across her face like shadows. "My vehicle took an RPG. 3 of my soldiers died instantly. I was bleeding out in an alley with hostiles closing in from every direction. I had maybe 2 minutes to live." She turned then, finally, to look at Vance. Her eyes were bright with tears, but her voice was pure steel. And then a ghost appeared, a man I had never seen before and would never officially meet. He came out of nowhere, killed 11 enemy combatants in under 3 minutes, picked me up like I weighed nothing, and carried me 2 miles through hostile territory to the extraction point. She stood slowly, releasing Elias's hand, and faced Vance fully. He had 3 bullets in his leg. He never mentioned them until we were on the helicopter. Never asked for recognition. Never filed for commendation. Just disappeared back into whatever shadow he had come from. Vance's face had gone the color of old paper. His hand opened, and the dog tag slipped from his fingers, falling to the floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silent ward. "That man," General Reeves continued, stepping toward Vance with the slow deliberation of a predator, "saved my life. He saved the lives of at least 47 other American service members during his career that I know of personally, and likely hundreds more in operations that remain classified. He has 3 silver stars, 2 bronze stars with valor, a purple heart with 2 oak leaf clusters. He has bled for this country in places that don't exist on any map, for missions that will remain secret until everyone who knows about them is dead." She stopped directly in front of Vance, close enough that he had to look down to meet her eyes. "And you," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried across the entire ward, tried to throw him out like garbage. Vance's mouth moved, but no sound came out. His clipboard fell from his nerveless fingers, clattering against the floor beside the dog tags. Around them, The ward remained frozen, every person present understanding that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years. Maya looked at Elias and saw that his eyes were open again, fixed on General Reeves with an expression of naked bewilderment, as though he couldn't understand why anyone would fight for him, as though he had forgotten that he was worth fighting for. General Reeves turned back to him. She bent down and picked up the dog tags from where they had fallen. She held them for a moment, reading the worn engravings, then walked back to the bed and placed them gently in his hands. "These belong to you," she said, "and so does every bit of care this hospital can provide." Her voice hardened again as she looked over her shoulder at Vance. "For as long as he needs it." The silence in the ward stretched like a held breath. General Reeves stood beside Elias's bed with one hand resting on his shoulder, a protective gesture that spoke louder than any words. Dr. Vance remained frozen where she had left him, his face cycling through shades of pale that Maya had never seen on a living person. Around them, the witnesses held their positions like actors waiting for the next scene of a play none of them had rehearsed. It was Vance who finally broke the silence, his voice emerging as something between a whisper and a croak. "General, I had no way of knowing." He dressed like there was nothing to indicate. His hands made helpless gestures in the air, grasping for excuses that kept dissolving before he could catch them. General Reeves turned to face him fully. Her expression had hardened into something that made Maya think of court-martials and dishonorable discharges and the kind of consequences that followed men for the rest of their lives. "Nothing to indicate," she repeated. "Let me tell you what there was to indicate, Doctor. There was a man who answered every question with military precision. There was a man who addressed every staff member with respect despite being treated with contempt. There was a man whose bearing, whose scars, whose very presence screamed decades of service to anyone who bothered to look." She stepped closer to Vance, and he actually took a step back. "But you didn't look. You saw a homeless man, and you decided he was worthless. You saw worn clothes, and you decided he was a liar. You made your judgment in 30 seconds, and you spent the rest of the day trying to throw him away. I was following protocol," Vance managed. "Resource allocation, bed management. These are real concerns." "Real concerns." General Reeves's voice dropped to something just above a whisper, but it carried across the entire ward. "Do you know what a real concern is, Doctor? A real concern is a soldier bleeding out in an alley in Mogadishu. A real concern is 11 enemy combatants closing in on your position with automatic weapons. A real concern is carrying a wounded officer 2 miles through hostile territory while bullets tear through your own leg." She paused, letting each word land. "Those are real concerns. Bed management is paperwork." Vance opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a new voice cut across the ward. "Ma'am, I have documentation." Everyone turned. Marcus Webb had stepped forward from his position near the nurse's station, his tablet held before him like evidence at trial. His rumpled blazer and mild expression seemed completely at odds with the tension crackling through the ward, but there was steel in his eyes that Maya hadn't noticed before. "Documentation of what?" General Reeves asked. "Of systemic mistreatment," Webb said. He walked toward them, his footsteps echoing in the silence. "I've been collecting evidence for 3 months. Statements from staff, recordings of interactions, patterns of dismissal and contempt directed at homeless veterans." He stopped beside the general and turned his tablet so she could see the screen. Dr. Vance refers to homeless patients as frequent flyers and system abusers. He's shortened hospital stays against medical advice on at least 40 occasions that I've documented. He's threatened staff members who advocated for patients he deemed unworthy. And today, he tried to discharge a decorated war hero back to the street because he didn't like the way he looked. The color had drained entirely from Vance's face. His eyes darted from Webb to General Reeves to the military police officers who still flanked the ward entrance. The predator who had stalked these halls for years suddenly looked very much like prey. "This is," Vance started. "This is insubordination. Unauthorized recording. I'll have your job for this." Webb smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant smile. I've already submitted my resignation, Dr. Vance. Effective today, along with a formal complaint to the VA Inspector General, the Hospital Ethics Board, and 3 separate congressional offices that oversee Veterans Affairs. He turned back to General Reeves. Ma'am, everything I have is at your disposal. General Reeves studied Webb for a moment, then nodded. Good man, she said. She turned to one of her aides. Get his contact information. I want copies of everything. She looked at Vance with an expression of pure contempt. And give me the hospital administrator. Now, the aide moved away, speaking rapidly into his phone. Around the ward, the frozen tableau had begun to shift as people realized that the immediate drama had passed and the institutional machinery was beginning to grind. Staff members who had remained silent during Vance's reign were now exchanging glances that spoke of long-suppressed grievances finally finding voice. Maya moved to Elias's bedside. The old man had been watching the confrontation with that same expression of bewilderment, as though the concept of people fighting for him was somehow foreign to his experience. His fingers had resumed their slow movement across the rosary beads, but there was something different in his eyes now, something that might have been the first faint stirring of hope. General Reeves noticed her movement and turned. You're Lieutenant Okonkwo, she said. The one who called. Yes, ma'am, Maya said. The general extended her hand, and Maya shook it. The grip was firm, warm, and carried the weight of genuine gratitude. Thank you, General Reeves said. If you hadn't made that call, if you hadn't stalled the discharge, we would have lost him again. She glanced at Elias with an expression that mixed sorrow with determination. We've already lost too many years. Maya nodded, not trusting her voice. She had spent the last few hours breaking rules, defying authority, and risking her career for a man she barely knew. Now, standing in the presence of a major general who was thanking her for that defiance, she felt the full weight of what she had done begin to settle on her shoulders. General Reeves seemed to understand. She squeezed Maya's hand once more before releasing it. You did the right thing, Lieutenant. That's not always rewarded in institutions like this, but should be. She looked around the ward at the watching faces. It should be. Then she turned back to Elias, pulling the chair close to his bed once more. Her voice softened as she addressed him, shifting from the command voice she had used with Vance to something gentler, more personal. Sergeant Major, she said, we have a lot to talk about. But first, I need you to understand something. She waited until his eyes met hers. What happened here today, this ends now. No more street. No more cardboard shelter. No more being invisible. Her voice carried the weight of an order wrapped in the warmth of a promise. You saved my life in Mogadishu. Today, I'm returning the favor. Elias looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Maya. Then he looked at the window, at the alley outside, at the shelter that had been his home for 3 years. When he turned back, there were tears on his weathered cheeks for the first time since Maria's funeral. I don't know if I deserve this, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. General Reeves took his hand again. That's not your decision to make, Sergeant Major. Not anymore. The hospital administrator arrived within 15 minutes. A thin man named Caldwell, whose perpetually anxious expression suggested he had spent his career anticipating disasters and finding them anyway. He took one look at the Major General standing in his ward, the military police flanking the entrances, and Dr. Vance standing pale and silent against the wall, and immediately understood that this was the disaster he had been waiting for his entire professional life. General Reeves briefed him with clinical efficiency. The patient in Bay 7, the attempted discharge, the documentation Marcus Webb had collected, the pattern of mistreatment that had apparently been operating under Caldwell's nose for years. With each point, the administrator's face grew more ashen, his hands clasping and unclasping at his sides like nervous birds. I want a full investigation, General Reeves concluded. Independent oversight. Every complaint against Dr. Vance reviewed. Every patient he's discharged in the last 3 years accounted for. She glanced at Vance, who seemed to have aged a decade in the last half hour. And I want him removed from patient care immediately, pending the investigation. Caldwell nodded rapidly. Of course, General. Absolutely. He turned to Vance with the expression of a man throwing a former ally to wolves. Dr. Vance, you're relieved of clinical duties effective immediately. Please surrender your access credentials and report to my office. Vance's mouth opened and closed several times. His eyes swept the ward, looking for allies and finding none. Staff members who had once jumped at his commands now avoided his gaze. Patients he had dismissed watched his humiliation with expressions ranging from satisfaction to outright joy. The kingdom he had built on contempt had crumbled in less than an hour. "This isn't over," he said finally, his voice thin and reedy. "I have rights. I have tenure. I have connections." General Reeves stepped toward him one final time. "So do I," she said quietly. "And mine are better." Two military police officers escorted Vance toward the ward exit. He walked between them with the shuffling gait of a man who had forgotten how to move with authority, his white coat hanging on his shoulders like a shroud. As he passed Base 7, he glanced toward Elias one last time. The old man met his eyes without anger, without satisfaction, without any expression at all. Just acknowledgement. One man seeing another. And then Vance was gone, and the ward seemed to breathe easier in his absence. The tension had broken, but the aftermath was only beginning. General Reeves returned to Elias's bedside while her aides coordinated with Caldwell on the details of the investigation. Maya found herself fielding questions from other staff members who had suddenly discovered courage they hadn't known they possessed. Stories began to emerge, accounts of Vance's cruelty that had been suppressed for years, each one adding weight to the case that Marcus Webb had been building. But in Base 7, a different kind of conversation was taking place. "Tell me what happened," General Reeves said softly. "After you retired, how did you end up here?" Elias's fingers moved across the rosary beads in their familiar rhythm. His eyes had that distant look again, fixed on memories that lived just beyond the present moment. For a long time, he said nothing, and Reeves waited with the patience of someone who understood that some stories needed space to emerge. "Maria," he said finally, "my wife. She was everything. 30 years of marriage. 30 years of her holding everything together while I disappeared into places I couldn't tell her about. She never complained, never asked questions she knew I couldn't answer. Just loved me and waited and welcomed me home every time like I had never left." He paused, his throat working against emotion. Reeves's hand found his again, offering anchor without pressure. "Ghost died in 2011, Elias continued. Thomas Oduya, my partner for 15 years. Took an RPG mint for me. I held him while he bled out. His last words were go home to her. Live the life I can't." He closed his eyes. "So I went home, and I found a letter from Maria's doctor on the kitchen counter. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. She had known for 3 weeks. She didn't tell me because she didn't want me to leave Ghost's funeral." The ward had gone quiet around them again. Staff members who had been moving through their tasks had slowed, caught by the gravity of the story being told. Even patients in nearby bays had turned their heads toward Base 7, listening. 8 months, Elias said. I had 8 months with her. I held her hand every day. I told her I loved her every hour. And I watched her disappear, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but her eyes looking at me and her voice telling me to live. His voice cracked, and then she was gone, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't live without her. Reeves squeezed his hand tighter. What happened next? I ran. The word came out flat, factual, like an after-action report of his own destruction. I couldn't look at our house, couldn't look at her pictures, couldn't look at the life we had built together. So I gave everything away, signed over the pension to charities she loved, packed a bag and walked out the door and kept walking until I couldn't remember the way back. You gave up your benefits, Reeves said. Your health care, your retirement, everything you earned. I didn't deserve them, Elias said. I saved senators and diplomats and generals. But I couldn't save my wife. I couldn't save Ghost. What good is a hero who can't protect the people he loves? The question hung in the air, heavy with 3 years of guilt and grief and self-imposed exile. Maya felt tears sliding down her own cheeks. Around the ward, she saw similar reactions on faces that had probably grown hardened to tragedy through years of working with damaged veterans. General Reeves was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of her own experiences, her own losses, her own journey through darkness. "Sergeant Major," she said, "you saved my life. You gave me 31 more years. 31 years of service. 31 years of soldiers I've trained and missions I've completed and a family I've raised. None of that would exist without you." She leaned closer. "You couldn't save Maria. That's not a failure. That's cancer. It's a disease, not a battle you lost. And Ghost, he didn't die because you failed him. He died doing his job, protecting his partner, exactly the way he would have wanted." Elias shook his head slowly. "You don't understand." "I understand exactly," Reeves said. "I've spent 30 years carrying guilt for soldiers I couldn't save, wondering if I gave the right orders, if I made the right calls, if the ones who died could have lived if I had just been better, smarter, faster." Her voice softened. "That guilt doesn't go away, but it doesn't have to destroy you either. You can carry it and still live. Maria asked you to live. Ghost asked you to live. They didn't ask you to suffer. They asked you to live." Elias looked at her with eyes that held decades of pain. "And if I don't know how anymore, then you let's teach you," Reeves said. She gestured around the ward at Maya, standing nearby, at Dr. Sharma, who had quietly returned and stood watching from the doorway, at the staff and patients who had witnessed everything. "You let the people who care about you carry some of the weight until you remember how to carry it yourself." For a long moment, Elias said nothing. His fingers had stopped moving on the rosary. His eyes moved from Reeves to Maya, to Dr. Sharma, to the window, where his cardboard shelter waited in the alley. The life he had built from grief and guilt. The life that had almost ended on the pavement that morning. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." It was barely a word, barely a commitment, but it was the first step on a road that led away from the alley, away from the cardboard, away from the slow death he had been choosing for 3 years. And everyone in that war understood they had just witnessed something more significant than a discharge being canceled. They had witnessed a man deciding, after years of darkness, to try living again. Word spread through the hospital like fire through dry grass. By evening, the story had reached every ward, every break room, every quiet corner where staff gathered to exchange the currency of institutional gossip. The homeless man in Base 7. The major general who had arrived with military police. The chief of medicine escorted out in disgrace. Details multiplied with each telling, some accurate and some embellished, but all carrying the same essential truth. Something extraordinary had happened, and nothing would be quite the same. The first veteran appeared at Base 7 around 6 o'clock. He was an elderly man in a wheelchair, Korean War cap perched on his white hair, pushed by a granddaughter who looked barely old enough to drive. He stopped at the gap in the curtains and simply looked at Elias for a long moment. Then he raised a trembling hand to his forehead in a salute that carried decades of meaning. "Spectre," he said, his voice cracked with age, but steady with purpose. "I was in the briefings, back when I still had clearance. I know what you did." Elias, who had been dozing after hours of conversation and emotion, opened his eyes. He saw the old soldier, the salute, the tears gathering in rheumy eyes. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of the warrior he had been, and he raised his own hand to return the gesture. "Thank you for your service, brother," he said quietly. The old man nodded, lowered his hand, and his granddaughter wheeled him away. But before they had reached the ward exit, another veteran had appeared, and then another, and then a steady stream that continued through the evening and into the night. They came in wheelchairs and on crutches. They came with 4 poles and oxygen tanks and the assistance of nurses who had suddenly discovered a willingness to bend visiting hours. They came from every corner of the hospital, veterans of every conflict from World War II to Afghanistan, drawn by the story of a legend who had been sleeping behind their hospital while they complained about the food and the waiting times and the indignities of institutional care. Some saluted, some simply nodded, some wept openly, offering handshakes that lingered longer than protocol allowed. A Vietnam veteran with one leg sat beside Elias's bed for 20 minutes without speaking a single word, just holding his hand, just being present in the particular silence that only combat survivors understood. Maya watched from the nurse's station, handling her regular duties while keeping one eye on the procession. General Reeves had left around 5, after ensuring that Elias's care was transferred to a team she personally trusted, but her presence seemed to linger in the changed atmosphere of the ward. Staff moved with more purpose. Patients were treated with more care. The invisible weight of Vance's contempt had lifted, and something kinder had rushed in to fill the vacuum. Dr. Sharma had pulled a chair into the corner of Base 7, observing the stream of visitors with professional interest and personal satisfaction. She caught Maya's eye at one point and nodded, a small gesture that communicated volumes. This is what healing looks like, that nod seemed to say. Not paperwork and protocols, but connection, community, the simple recognition of shared humanity. Around 9 o'clock, a group appeared that made Maya's breath catch. For men in their 30s, all carrying themselves with the particular bearing of special operations soldiers. They wore civilian clothes, but everything about them screamed elite military, from their haircuts to their posture to the way they scanned the ward for threats before proceeding to Base 7. The leader stopped at the foot of Elias's bed. "Sergeant Major Navarro," he said. His voice was controlled, professional, but something burned beneath the surface. "I'm Master Sergeant Dominic Reyes, 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. We came as soon as we heard." Elias pushed himself up against his pillows, and this time his arms didn't tremble. The warrior was closer to the surface now, summoned by the presence of his tribe. "You didn't have to come," he said. "Yes, we did," Reyes replied. He stepped closer, and his professional mask slipped to reveal something raw underneath. "Your operations are still studied at the unit, Sergeant Major. Your techniques, your tactics, the way you carried out missions that nobody else could complete." He paused, visibly collecting himself. "Every one of us learned from you. Every one of us is alive because of lessons you taught without ever meeting us." The other 3 operators nodded in unison. One of them, a massive man with Pacific Islander features, spoke up. When word reached the unit that Spectre was found, that he was here, he shook his head slowly. "Command gave us 48 hours leave on the spot. Didn't even have to ask." Elias looked at them, at these young warriors who had sought him out, and something in his face began to crack. The armor he had built over 3 years of solitude, the walls he had constructed to contain his grief, started to show fractures. "I'm not," he started, then stopped. His voice had grown thick. "I'm not who I was. I'm not the man in those briefings anymore." Reyes moved to the side of the bed, the same side where General Reeves had sat, where Dr. Sharma still observed, where so many hands had reached for Elias throughout this endless day. "With respect, Sergeant Major," he said, "you're exactly who you were. You just forgot for a while." He reached into his pocket and withdrew something that caught the fluorescent light. A challenge coin, Maya realized. The kind that special operations units minted for their own, that carried more weight among warriors than any official medal. "The unit wanted you to have this," Reyes said. He pressed it into Elias's palm. "It's been waiting for you. We just didn't know where to send it." Elias looked down at the coin in his hand. His fingers closed around it, and his shoulders began to shake. The tears he had shed earlier had been quiet, controlled, the grief of a man who had learned to suffer in silence. But these tears were different. These came from somewhere deeper, somewhere he had walled off so completely that even he had forgotten it existed. The 4 operators stood at attention while their legend wept. Maya found herself crying too, along with half the staff on the ward. Even Dr. Sharma wiped her eyes behind her glasses. After a long moment, Reyes spoke again. "We're not leaving the area, Sergeant Major. Not until you're back on your feet. The unit takes care of its own." Elias looked up at them through his tears. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for finding me." Reyes smiled, and for the first time, he looked his age instead of ageless. "We've always known where you were, Sergeant Major. We were just waiting for you to be ready to come home." The words hung in the air, weighted with meaning that transcended their simple structure. Home, not a place, but a people. Not a building, but a belonging. The thing Elias had been running from for 3 years, believing he no longer deserved it. The thing that had found him anyway. The days that followed blurred together in a rhythm of recovery that Elias had never expected to experience. The hospital kept him for a week, treating the malnutrition and dehydration and minor infections that 3 years of street life had accumulated in his body. But the physical healing was the smallest part of what happened in Base 7. General Reeves returned twice, once to check on his progress, and once to personally inform him that Dr. Vance had been placed on indefinite administrative leave pending a full investigation. The documentation Marcus Webb had collected, combined with the statements that staff members had finally felt safe to provide, painted a picture of systematic neglect that would likely end not just Vance's career, but trigger reforms across the entire VA system. The story had reached the press. Congressional offices were making inquiries. What had happened in this ward was becoming a catalyst for change that extended far beyond one hospital. But for Elias, the more significant visitor was Dr. Sharma, who came every day, sometimes for formal sessions, and sometimes just to sit with him in comfortable silence. She didn't push. She didn't probe. She simply created space for him to exist without judgment, and slowly, word by word, he began to fill that space with the things he had carried alone for so long. He told her about the missions, not the classified details, but the weight of them. The faces of men he had killed, the faces of men he had saved, the impossible calculus of combat where every choice meant someone lived and someone died. He told her about the nightmares that had started after Mogadishu and never really stopped, just changed their settings and their cast of characters as decades of operations layered trauma upon trauma. He told her about Maria, about their courtship and their marriage and the quiet ways she had held him together through all of it, about the guilt he felt for every deployment, every missed anniversary, every time she had woken alone in their bed while he was halfway around the world doing things she would never know about the greater guilt of not being there when she needed him most, even though she had hidden her diagnosis specifically to spare him that guilt. And he told her about Ghost, about Thomas Odia, who had been his partner and his brother and the one person in the world who understood exactly what their life demanded, about the ambush that had killed him, the RPG that had come from a window they had cleared twice, the 90 seconds it had taken for him to bleed out in Elias's arms, about the last words that had become both blessing and curse. Go home to her. Live the life I can't. Dr. Sharma listened to all of it. She didn't offer easy solutions or therapeutic platitudes. She just received his words like gifts and held them carefully, letting him know that his story had been heard, that his pain had been witnessed, that he was no longer carrying it alone. On the 4th day, Maya brought him a package that had arrived at the hospital. Inside was a folded flag, carefully preserved, accompanied by a letter on official stationery. The flag had been presented at Ghost's funeral, the letter explained, and his family wanted Elias to have it. They had been trying to find him for years. Elias held the flag for a long time, his fingers tracing the familiar folds, his eyes distant with memory. Then he asked Maya if she could help him write a letter back. On the 5th day, the Delta operators who had visited returned with a different kind of gift. Civilian clothes in his size, carefully selected. Toiletries and personal items. A new copy of The Old Man and the Sea to replace the water-damaged one he had carried through 3 years of homelessness. And keys to an apartment near the base, paid for by a fund that the unit maintained for exactly these situations. You don't have to accept it, Master Sergeant Reyes said. But it's there, for as long as you need it. Elias looked at the keys in his hand. A week ago, he would have refused. A week ago, he was still convinced he deserved the alley and the cardboard and the slow disappearance he had been choosing. But something had shifted in the days since he had collapsed behind the hospital. Something had cracked open and let light into places that had been dark for years. Okay, he said. It was the same word he had spoken to General Reeves, but this time it came easier. This time it sounded less like surrender and more like acceptance. On the 6th day, he walked. Not far, just a slow circuit of the ward with Maya on one side and a physical therapist on the other. His legs trembled. His lungs burned. 3 years of neglect had taken a toll that would require months to repair. But he walked, and when he reached the window that looked out over the alley, he stopped. The cardboard shelter was still there, arranged with military precision, exactly as he had left it. His home for 3 years. His hiding place. His slow grave. "Could someone take that down?" he asked quietly. "I don't think I need it anymore." Maya squeezed his arm. "I'll make sure it's done," she said. On the 7th day, Dr. Sharma came with a different kind of offer. She ran a support group for combat veterans, she explained. Not part of the official VA system, not bound by the bureaucracy and limitations that had failed so many. Just a room, some chairs, veterans who had seen things they couldn't unsee, talking to each other about how to live anyway. No pressure, she said. No requirements. If you show up, you show up. If you don't, the door stays open. Elias thought about it for a long moment. The idea of sitting in a circle, of sharing his pain with strangers, of admitting out loud that he needed help. Everything in his training, everything in his decades of being the one who saved others, rebelled against the concept. But Maria's voice whispered in his memory. "Live. Just live." And Ghost's voice echoed alongside it. "Go home to her. Live the life I can't." He had failed them both by dying slowly in an alley. Maybe he could honor them by learning to live again. "I'll be there," he said. Dr. Sharma smiled, and it was a smile of genuine warmth, of welcome, of a door opening onto a path he hadn't known existed. "Good," she said. "We meet Thursdays at 7. I'll save you a seat." That night, Elias slept without nightmares for the first time in longer than he could remember. And when he woke, he looked at the ceiling and realized that it wasn't the ceiling of Bay 7 anymore. It wasn't the sky visible through cardboard gaps. It was just a ceiling in a room in a hospital where people had fought for him. And tomorrow, he would leave this place and begin the long, uncertain process of building a life worth living. 6 months later, Elias stood before a circle of folding chairs in the basement of a community center that smelled of coffee and old carpet, and the particular kind of hope that grows in rooms where broken people gather to become less broken together. 12 faces looked back at him, veterans ranging from a 23-year-old Marine who still flinched at loud noises to a 78-year-old Korean War survivor who had spent 50 years pretending he was fine before finally admitting he wasn't. "My name is Elias," he said. His voice was stronger now, steadier, though it still carried the rasp of years spent in silence. Call sign was Spectre, and I spent 3 years sleeping in an alley because I believed I didn't deserve to live. The room held its familiar silence, the kind that invited rather than judged. Dr. Sharma sat in her usual corner, observing but not leading, letting the veterans find their own way through the darkness they shared. Elias continued. "I lost my best friend in Afghanistan. Held him while he bled out. His last words were, 'Go home to her, live the life I can't.' So I went home, and I found out my wife was dying, and I couldn't save her either." He paused, his fingers moving unconsciously toward the rosary that still hung around his neck, now polished clean, the beads smooth from decades of prayer. "After she died, I ran, gave away everything. Convinced myself I didn't deserve the pension, the health care, the life we had built together. I was trying to disappear, and I almost succeeded." He looked around the circle, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. Some of those eyes were wet. Some were hard with the effort of containing emotion. All of them understood. "But here's what I learned," Elias said. "The people we lose, they don't want us to suffer. They want us to live." Maria's last word to me was live. Just live. And Ghost, he didn't die, so I could waste the years he gave me. He died so I could use them. He let out a slow breath. I forgot that for a while. I forgot how to live without feeling guilty for surviving. Some days I still forget. But I keep coming back here, and I keep trying, and slowly it gets easier. A young woman in the circle, Army medic, 2 tours in Iraq, spoke up. "How do you know when you're getting better?" Elias considered the question. "You don't," he said finally. "Not really. There's no finish line, no moment when you're fixed. but you start noticing things. A night without nightmares. A meal that tastes like something. A morning when you wake up and you're not immediately sorry you did. He smiled, and it was a real smile, the kind that reaches eyes. The good moments start outnumbering the bad ones. And eventually, you realize you're not just surviving anymore. You're actually living. After the meeting, Elias helped stack the chairs the way he always did. It had become his ritual, his small contribution to the space that had given him so much. Dr. Sharma approached as he finished, 2 cups of coffee in her hands. "You're good at this," she said, handing him one. "Talking to them. Reaching them." Elias shook his head. "I just tell the truth. They do the hard work themselves. That's what makes you good at it," she replied. She took a sip of her coffee, watching him over the rim. "I've been thinking. The program is expanding. More groups, more locations. We need people to help lead them. Veterans who've been through it, who can show others the path. You want me to lead a group? I want you to consider it. No pressure, but you have something these men and women need. Living proof that it's possible to come back from the edge." Elias was quiet for a long moment. Through the basement windows, he could see the evening light fading into dusk. 6 months ago, he would have been settling into his cardboard shelter around this time, wrapping himself in a blanket that smelled of the street, watching stars appear through gaps in his makeshift roof. Now he had an apartment, a purpose, people who counted on him showing up. "Let me think about it," he said. Dr. Sharma nodded. The doors always open. He walked home through streets that had become familiar, past the VA hospital where everything had changed. He paused at the alley where he used to sleep. Someone had planted flowers there, a small garden tended by staff who had heard his story. A plaque on the wall read simply, "For those who served in silence." Elias touched the plaque gently, then continued on. His apartment was small but sufficient. Clean, warm. The walls held photographs now. Maria on their wedding day, Ghost in full tactical gear grinning at the camera, the Delta operators who had welcomed him back into the fold. General Reeves had sent a framed copy of her own commissioning photo, inscribed with words he kept private but read every morning. On his desk sat a letter he had been working on for weeks. A formal proposal to establish a mentorship program connecting isolated veterans with others who had found their way back. General Reeves had offered to sponsor it through military channels. Marcus Webb, now working for a veterans advocacy nonprofit, had pledged administrative support. Maya, promoted to head of a new veteran dignity initiative at the hospital, had volunteered to help identify those most in need. It was more than Elias had ever expected, more than he had believed he deserved. But he was learning, slowly, that deserving wasn't the point. The point was using what he had left to help others find what he had found. He picked up the rosary from where it lay beside Maria's photograph. The beads moved through his fingers in their familiar rhythm. 53 prayers for the living and the dead. "Still here, my love," he whispered. "Still trying." He set the rosary down and picked up his pen. There was work to do, lives to reach, a legacy to build from the wreckage of his own. Outside his window, the city lights flickered to life against the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, another veteran was sleeping in an alley, convinced they deserved nothing better. Another hero was disappearing into the shadows, forgotten by the country they had served. But not for long. Not if Elias had anything to say about it. He began to write. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that second chances are possible, that heroes can be found in the most unexpected places, please subscribe to our channel. And right now on your screen, you'll see another incredible story waiting for you. Click it, watch it, and remember, every person you pass on the street has a story. Some of them might just be legendary. Thank you for watching.